The last thing Private Dmitry Volkov wrote in his duty log was 3 words: "The cold thinks." They found him 3 days later, standing upright in the snow. Not collapsed, not curled against the wind, standing. His eyes were open, staring at nothing, frost crystals growing inside the pupils like delicate flowers. He wasn't alone. 11 soldiers formed a perfect circle around him, each man facing outward, rifles still gripped in translucent hands. Their skin had turned to ice, but their faces showed no pain, no fear. Only a strange expression that the recovery team described as listening. This happened in February 1893, along a frozen supply road in Siberia, during the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railroad. The Imperial Russian Army classified every document related to Section 47 within hours. The 12 soldiers were declared deserters, the road was abandoned, and for 130 years, this story remained buried in military archives marked "Abnormal Incident, No Further, Investigation." Before we uncover what really happened, make sure you're subscribed. Because what transformed those men wasn't hypothermia. It wasn't madness. It was something far older than the Russian Empire. Something that had been waiting beneath the permafrost for 1,000 years, and something that still waits in frozen places today. I should never have accepted the position of medical officer for Road Section 47, but in St. Petersburg, a man with gambling debts doesn't ask questions when the Imperial Army offers triple pay. The letter arrived on a January morning in 1893, delivered by a courier who wouldn't meet my eyes. The position was simple: 6 months as medical officer for a railroad construction site in eastern Siberia. The pay was 300 rubles monthly, 3 times what I earned at the military hospital. I signed the contract that afternoon. My creditors gave me 3 days to pack. The train journey took 11 days. I watched St. Petersburg's grand architecture dissolve into provincial towns, then scattered villages, then nothing but endless white. The temperature dropped 10 degrees each day. By the time we crossed the Urals, frost grew on the inside of my train window, despite the coal stove burning constantly. I scraped it away with my fingernail and watched the landscape beyond. Birch forests so dense, they looked like walls, frozen rivers that stretched wider than city streets, and a sky that seemed lower somehow, pressing down with the weight of winter. At Tyumen, I transferred to a military transport sled. My escort was a Cossack sergeant named Gregor, a man with a face like weathered leather and eyes that had seen things he'd decided not to remember. For 2 days, we spoke pleasantly about inconsequential things: the quality of tobacco, the reliability of horses, the tedium of garrison duty. Then, on the 3rd morning, we passed through a small Evenki village. I mentioned to the driver that we were heading to Section 47. Every villager within earshot stopped moving. An old woman dropped the bucket she was carrying. A man crossing the road turned and walked the other way without looking back. 3 children who'd been playing in the snow ran to their mother, who pulled them inside and slammed the door. The eldest villager, a man with a beard like yellow ice, made the sign of the cross, Orthodox style, right to left, then spat in the snow 3 times. Sergeant Gregor's pleasant demeanor evaporated. He didn't speak again for 6 hours. "What was that about?" I finally asked as we made camp that evening. Gregor poked the fire with a stick, not looking at me. "Local superstition. These people see demons in every shadow." They seemed genuinely frightened. Section 47 has a reputation. He paused, choosing his words carefully. The previous medical officer left after 6 weeks. The posting is supposed to be 6 months. Why did he leave? He didn't say. The one before him lasted 4 weeks. The one before that? Gregor trailed off, finally meeting my eyes. The one before that didn't leave at all. I waited for elaboration. None came. The next day we crossed into what Gregor called the zone. Though I saw no markers, no signs, nothing to distinguish this stretch of forest from the hundreds of kilometers we'd already traveled, but Gregor felt it. His jaw tightened. His hand moved unconsciously to the knife at his belt. The horses sensed it too, ears flattening, steps becoming reluctant. The air felt different. Colder, yes, but also heavier, as if the atmosphere itself had thickened. We reached Section 47 at dusk. The construction camp sprawled across a clearing carved from the forest, a collection of wooden barracks, supply sheds, and a single large building that served as headquarters and mess hall. 200 workers, Gregor had told me, 40 soldiers to guard them. I counted the structures and did the math. Men packed shoulder to shoulder, sharing bunks, sharing warmth. The kind of conditions that bred disease, accidents, and resentment. Captain Orlovsky met me at the camp perimeter. He was perhaps 50, with iron grey hair and a face that had long ago settled into permanent severity. But it was his eyes that unsettled me. Pale blue, almost colourless and utterly exhausted. Not physically tired, spiritually tired. The eyes of a man who had stopped questioning orders because questions led to answers he didn't want to hear. Dr. Morozov. His handshake was brief and cold even through our gloves. "You'll bunk in the medical cabin. It's isolated from the main camp. Better for quarantine if disease breaks out." He said this as if disease were the primary concern, as if there weren't other reasons a man might want to be isolated. That first night I met the key players in what I would later think of as the final performance. Sergeant Dmitry Volkov found me as I was unpacking my medical supplies. He was 28, but carried himself with the careful precision of someone much older. A veteran of the Turkish wars, he told me, as if that explained everything about him. Perhaps it did. He kept a duty log in a leather-bound journal that he consulted constantly, making notes in a cramped, meticulous hand. When I asked what he was recording, he said simply, "Details. Details matter when nothing else makes sense." Private Konstantin was his opposite, 19 years old, with a farm boy's broad shoulders and a believer's bright eyes. He still thought military service was glorious. He still thought following orders would keep him safe. He reminded me of myself at that age, before the military hospital taught me that the body is just meat and medicine is just guesswork dressed in Latin. The engineer, Yevgeny Richter, was a German contractor hired for his expertise in cold weather construction. He had the manic energy of a man fighting a losing battle against time itself. Every conversation circled back to the schedule. 8 weeks until spring thaw. 3 kilometers of road left to grade. Investors in Moscow demanding progress. He drank tea constantly, but never seemed to warm up, his hands trembling slightly whenever they were still. And then there was Babushka Daria. She was Evenki, local to these forests, hired as camp cook because she knew which plants stayed edible through winter and which game could be hunted without angering the forest spirits. She was perhaps 70, perhaps 90. Her face was too weathered to tell. During the day, she spoke serviceable Russian, barking orders at her kitchen assistants and negotiating food supplies with Orlovsky. But I noticed that after sunset, she stopped speaking Russian entirely. Only Evenki, and she never, ever looked toward the forest after dark. The temperature that night was minus 40 degrees Celsius. I'd experienced Siberian winters before, but this cold felt different. It didn't just chill, it pressed. It had weight. Sound traveled strangely, arriving delayed or not at all. The darkness between the torches seemed thicker than normal darkness, almost textured. Workers moved between buildings in silence, and when they did speak, it was in whispers, as if raising their voices might wake something. I fell asleep to the sound of wind in the pines and the distant crack of trees splitting in the cold. I was awakened at 3 in the morning by pounding on my door. "Doctor, medical emergency." The worker's name was Pyotr. He'd been injured in what Sergeant Volkov described as a routine accident, slipped on ice while hauling timber, caught his hand between 2 logs. Simple crush injury. I'd treated dozens. I set his broken fingers, applied a poultice for the swelling, and wrapped the hand in clean bandages. Textbook treatment. He should have healed in 3 weeks. Instead, the frostbite got worse. Day 1, slight discoloration in the fingertips. Day 2, blackening spreading to the second knuckle. Day 3, tissue death advancing past the wrist despite the hand being kept warm and dry. It was as if the injury were aging in reverse, getting worse instead of better, traveling backward through the stages of healing until it reached something that couldn't be called healing at all. On the 4th day, Pyotr developed a fever and began raving. "I heard my name," he told me, gripping my arm with his good hand. His pupils were dilated, his breathing shallow. In the forest, I heard my grandmother's voice calling me. She's been dead 15 years, doctor, but I heard her clear as church bells. She said she'd been waiting for me. She said the cold would keep me safe. Hypothermia-induced hallucination, I wrote in my notes. Delirium from infection. I followed her voice into the trees, Pyotr continued. I don't remember how long. Could have been minutes, could have been hours. When I came back to myself, I was standing in a clearing I'd never seen before, and my hand was already black. You wandered in -40-degree weather, I said gently. The frostbite is from exposure. Then explain my footprints, doctor. I didn't understand what he meant until Volkov showed me the next morning. He'd followed Pyotr's trail into the forest, standard procedure when someone claims amnesia. The footprints were clear in the fresh snow, boot prints leaving the camp, heading into the trees, going deeper and deeper into the forest. Then, 50 meters from camp, they simply stopped, not obscured by wind, not covered by fresh snow, just stopped, mid-stride as if Pyotr had been plucked from the ground mid-step. And there were no return prints, no sign of how he'd made it back to camp. Wind couldn't have covered them that selectively, Volkov said, staring at the final print. And even if it had, there'd be some disturbance, some indication. This is like he stopped existing in one place and started existing in another. Pyotr died that night. The infection had spread to his blood, and I had neither the equipment nor the expertise to stop sepsis. His last words were in a language I didn't recognize, not Russian, not Evenki, something older and harsher. His eyes were open when he died, and they were looking at something I couldn't see. Captain Orlovsky arrived at the medical cabin an hour after death, accompanied by 4 soldiers carrying firewood. Cremation, he said flatly. Immediately. Captain, I haven't completed the medical examination. I need to document the cause of death for cremation. Immediately. His pale eyes fixed on me with an intensity that stopped my protest cold. This is a standing order for all deaths at Section 47. No exceptions, no delays. We burned Pyotr's body in the camp forge. The smell was horrible, but what disturbed me more was the efficiency of it. The soldiers moved with practiced precision, as if they'd done this many times before. When the fire had reduced the body to ash, I confronted Orlovsky in his office. I deserve an explanation, Captain. That man died from an infection that progressed impossibly fast from a minor injury. His symptoms don't match any pathology I've studied. And his story about the footprints, you're the 4th medical officer in 2 years, Dr. Morozov. Orlovsky's voice was quiet, almost gentle. The first one documented everything, kept detailed records, asked all the right questions. He lasted 7 weeks before he requested immediate transfer. The second one tried to rationalize everything scientifically. 4 weeks. The third one, he paused. The third one started believing the workers' stories. He didn't request a transfer. We found him walking barefoot in the snow 3 kilometers from camp, trying to follow a voice only he could hear. He lost both feet to frostbite. Orlovsky leaned forward, and for the first time, I saw fear in those exhausted eyes. So, I'm asking you, Doctor, do you want to be the 5th medical officer? Or do you want to do your job? Keep men alive when you can, and stop asking questions about the things you can't explain. I should have requested a transfer that night. I should have packed my bag and been on the next supply sled heading west. But I was young enough to still believe that every mystery had a rational explanation, and arrogant enough to think I was smarter than the men who'd come before me. I want to understand what's happening here, I said. Orlovsky sighed. It was the sound of a man watching another man make a terrible mistake. Then you'll need to understand your assignment. The road you see outside, 15 kilometers of graded frozen supply route connecting the rail depot to the forward construction site. It crosses a section of forest the Evenki call the place where memory freezes. We're not supposed to discuss what that means. 3 previous guard units requested immediate transfer. The 4th unit, he stopped, choosing his words carefully, had to be replaced entirely. Why? Because men started seeing things, hearing things, and then some of them started becoming things. He pulled out a map and traced a line with his finger. The road must be guarded at night. 12 soldiers, 4 posts, 3 men per post, 3-hour rotations, standard equipment, rifles, flares, fire barrels for warmth, and iron chains. Chains for what? The men wrap them around the guard posts, around their wrists sometimes. They say iron helps. I don't ask what it helps with. He rolled up the map. Your medical duties include examining the guards after each night shift. You'll notice certain patterns. Document them if you must, but don't try to explain them. And doctor, he met my eyes. When the guards refuse to talk about what they saw, don't push them. Some silences are merciful. That first night, I stood at my cabin window and watched the guard detail march into the darkness. 12 men, carrying rifles and iron chains, walking toward a road that crossed something the locals wouldn't name. The temperature had dropped to -45 degrees. Their breath created clouds of vapor that hung in the still air long after they'd passed. By morning, Post 3 would be completely silent. Not because the men had vanished, but because they refused to speak about what they'd seen. And they would all have frostbite on their right hands only. Always the right hands. The hands that held their weapons. The hands they'd raised to point at something in the darkness. Something that had pointed back. The first rule I learned about Section 47 wasn't written in any manual. Never ask a soldier what happened during the night watch. The second rule, if a man starts describing the cold as having a voice, you have less than 48 hours. I learned both rules during my first week of medical examinations. The pattern revealed itself slowly, the way frost creeps across a window, beautiful in its precision, terrible in its implications. Every morning at dawn, the night guard would return from their post along the road. Standard procedure required a brief medical check, signs of frostbite, hypothermia, injury, simple preventive care. But nothing about Section 47 was simple. The frostbite always appeared on the right hand, always. 12 men rotating through 4 posts, different soldiers each night, and every single case of cold injury manifested in the right hand, specifically the thumb, index, and middle finger. The grip fingers, the fingers that hold a rifle. In 20 years of military medicine, I'd never seen environmental injury select for specific anatomy with such precision. Cold doesn't discriminate, it takes whatever it touches. But this did discriminate, this was selective. The men reported time distortions that defied explanation. A 3-hour watch shift would feel like 15 minutes to one soldier and 6 hours to another. Both would insist they were correct. Both would have pocket watches that confirmed regulation timing. Yet their subjective experience diverged so radically that they'd argue about whether dawn had come too early or too late, despite standing at the same post, watching the same sky. Temperature perception inverted in ways that violated basic physiology. Soldiers would return from -45-degree watches complaining of heat, not the false warmth of final stage hypothermia. I knew those symptoms intimately. This was different. They'd be sweating under their coats, faces flushed, pupils dilated, while their core temperature registered dangerously low. Their bodies were freezing while their brains insisted they were burning. And the dreams. Every guard reported the same dream, walking backward through snow, watching their own footprints disappear ahead of them, moving towards something they couldn't see but knew was waiting. They'd wake with the sensation of falling, even though they were lying in their bunks. Some woke screaming. Most woke silent, with that terrible expression Pyotr had worn, the look of someone who'd seen the answer to a question they'd never wanted to ask. I documented everything in medical logs. 17 cases of right-hand frostbite in 5 days, 23 reports of time dilation, 31 instances of inverted temperature perception, 47 identical dream reports. The statistical probability of this clustering was effectively 0. This wasn't coincidence. This was pattern. Sergeant Volkov found me in the medical cabin on the 6th night after the rest of the camp had fallen into uneasy sleep. He stood in my doorway without speaking, his duty log clutched in his left hand. His right hand, I noticed, was wrapped in fresh bandages. "May I show you something, doctor?" His voice was quiet, almost apologetic. "Something I haven't shown Captain Orlovsky." He opened the log and set it on my examination table. The pages showed meticulous records, temperature readings, wind direction, visibility conditions, routine observations recorded in neat Cyrillic script, standard military documentation, but in the margins, written in a smaller, more cramped hand, were other notes, some in Russian, some in what looked like code, some in no language I recognized, just symbols that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. "It came closer tonight," one margin note read. "Saw father's face, but father died at Plevna," read another. "The cold has math," read a third. "Counted 17 beats between manifestations. Prime number, always prime." Volkov watched me read, his expression carefully neutral. "I've been keeping 2 logs," he said finally. "The official one for Orlovsky, and this one, for myself. Or maybe for whoever comes after me. After you. The pattern is accelerating, Doctor. 6 weeks ago, when I first arrived at Section 47, the incidents happened every 4 or 5 nights. Now they happen every night. 6 weeks ago, we saw shapes in the distance. Now they're close enough to touch. 6 weeks ago, the frostbite was superficial. Now, he unwrapped his right hand. The damage was extensive. 3rd-degree frostbite across all 4 fingers and the thumb. But the tissue wasn't blackened. It was translucent, almost crystalline, as if the flesh were transforming into ice while somehow remaining alive. I could see the outline of bones beneath the skin. But they looked wrong. Too geometric. Too regular. "It's spreading," Volkov said. "Started in my fingertips 3 days ago. Now it's past the knuckles. I can still move them, still feel them. But they don't feel like my fingers anymore. They feel like they belong to something else, something that's borrowing them. Why haven't you reported this? Because reporting it means cremation, Doctor. You saw what happened to Pyotr. Orlovsky's orders are clear. Anyone showing advanced symptoms gets burned. No examination, no documentation, no questions." He closed his duty log carefully. "I'm showing you because you're a scientist. You think in terms of evidence and explanation. Maybe you can find the pattern I'm missing. Maybe you can solve this before it solves us." I wanted to tell him I would. I wanted to offer hope. But I'd seen his fingers. I'd seen the crystallization spreading. And I knew with grim certainty that Sergeant Dmitry Volkov had less than 48 hours before whatever was transforming him completed its work. The next morning, I sought out Babushka Daria. I found her behind the mess hall, preparing a brace of winter hares for the evening meal. She didn't look up when I approached, but she knew I was there. She always knew. "You want to ask about the cold," she said in Russian, though her accent was thick, each word carefully formed. "The cold that hunts. I want to understand what's happening to my patients." "Your patients are already gone, Doctor. Their bodies just haven't realized it yet." She set down her knife and finally looked at me with eyes the color of old ice. "We have a name for this place. Koyun Kara. You would say the cold that hunts, but that's not quite right. The better translation is the cold that remembers." "Remembers what?" "Everyone who dies here. Everything that freezes." This land has been forbidden to my people for 300 years. Our grandmothers' grandmothers knew to stay away. They carved warnings in the trees, left markers in stone. But the Russians came with their railroad and their ambition, and they didn't listen to old women's stories. She pulled something from her coat, a small leather pouch worn smooth with age. Inside were pieces of birch bark covered in symbols, not writing exactly, more like warnings rendered in pictographic form. And in the center of each bark piece was the same image, men standing in a circle, facing outward, with something vast and empty in the center. This is what happens when the cold remembers, Daria said. It takes your shape, it takes your thoughts, and then it takes your warmth. Not to kill you. Killing is too quick. It preserves you, keeps you awake and aware and frozen for... She made a gesture that might have meant forever. My people found them once long ago. 17 hunters who went into these woods and never returned. We found them 2 seasons later, standing in a perfect circle, eyes open, still breathing, still conscious but frozen. And they stayed that way for months before we built the courage to burn them. That's impossible. The human body can't survive below freezing, can't remain conscious without metabolic function, can't crystallize and still think. She smiled without humor. You're a scientist, doctor. You believe in impossible things all the time. Cells you can't see, diseases spread by air, electricity in the nerves. Why not this? Why not a cold that remembers and thinks and wants? Because cold is just the absence of heat. It's not an entity. It doesn't have consciousness. No, she pointed toward the forest. Then explain your soldiers. Explain the patterns. Explain why they all dream the same dream. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. Explain why. If you go onto that road at night and listen very carefully, you can hear it counting. I left Daria and her warnings and her bark pieces and went to find engineer Yevgeny. If I couldn't accept supernatural explanations, I needed natural ones, geological phenomena, underground gases, something rational. I found him in the headquarters building, surrounded by maps and drilling, reports and increasingly frantic correspondence from Moscow. He'd lost weight since I arrived. His hands trembled constantly now, and his eyes had the glassy look of a man surviving on tea and terror. The investors are threatening to pull funding, he said, without preamble when I entered. We're 3 weeks behind schedule. The ground is harder than predicted. The equipment keeps failing in the cold. And the men... He trailed off. The men are afraid to work. They have reason to be afraid. It's just cold, doctor. Just weather. We're engineers. We solve problems. Bridges, roads, rail lines. Nothing mysterious. Nothing supernatural. Just engineering challenges requiring engineering solutions. Show me your drilling reports. His hesitation lasted only a moment before exhaustion overcame caution. He pulled out a stack of geological surveys and temperature logs. We found something during the excavation. An underground cavity. Natural formation, probably. Old ice cave or collapsed. Limestone chamber. But the readings don't make sense. I studied the numbers. Temperature at the surface, minus 43 degrees. Temperature at 10 meters depth, minus 41 degrees. Temperature at the cavity, 15 meters down, minus 38 degrees. The cavity was warmer than the ground above it. In winter, in Siberia. That's impossible, I said. That's what I thought. So, I took atmospheric samples. He showed me another log. Air composition at the cavity, 73% nitrogen, 26% oxygen, 0.9% argon, normal atmospheric ratios, but also trace methane, elevated carbon dioxide and something else. Something that doesn't match any compound in my reference tables. The spectrometer couldn't identify it. You think there's something down there. I think we didn't build a road, Doctor. I think we opened something. Something that was sealed under permafrost for a very long time, and now it's awake. That night I volunteered for guard duty. Captain Orlovsky tried to dissuade me. Medical officers don't stand watch, Doctor. That's not your function. My function is to understand what's harming my patients. I can't do that from the medical cabin. He studied me with those pale, exhausted eyes. Then he nodded. Post 2. You'll accompany Private Konstantin and 2 veterans. Stay close to the fire. Don't wander. And doctor? If Konstantin tells you he sees something, believe him. Post 2 was a wooden shelter at the midpoint of the 15-kilometer road. 3 walls and a fire barrel, positioned to give sight lines in both directions. Konstantin and the 2 veterans were already there when I arrived, their faces grim in the firelight. The temperature was -45 when we started the watch. Within an hour, it had dropped to -50. I'd experienced extreme cold before, but this was different. This cold had presence. It pressed against exposed skin, not like air, but like substance, thick, resistant, almost tangible. Sound behaved strangely. Voices seemed to come from wrong directions. The crackle of the fire delayed by a half second, as if traveling through something denser than air. Then the stars began to flicker. Not twinkling. That's atmospheric distortion, normal and natural. This was flickering, like a candle flame in wind. Individual stars would dim, brighten, dim again in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Konstantin saw it too. He stood suddenly, rifle raised, staring at the sky. "Sir, are you seeing?" "The stars, yes." I pulled out my pocket watch to mark the time. The hands had stopped. Not broken, stopped. I tapped the crystal. The second hand jerked backward 3 positions, then forward 5, then stopped again. A low-frequency hum began to vibrate through the ground. I felt it in my chest, in my teeth, in the bones of my skull. Not sound exactly. Pressure, rhythm, like a heartbeat from the earth itself. Frost patterns appeared on the road surface, forming geometric shapes that were too regular to be natural. Circles within circles, radiating lines, symbols that looked almost like writing in a language of ice and crystalline structure. "There," Konstantin whispered, pointing with his rifle. 20 meters down the road, something stood. I saw it for perhaps 3 seconds before my brain refused to process what my eyes were reporting. A figure, human-sized, human-shaped, but made entirely of frost crystals. Not covered in frost, but constructed from it. Translucent, intricate, impossible. It had no features, no details, just the suggestion of a human outline rendered in ice and air. It stood in Konstantin's exact posture, rifle raised, head tilted at the same angle, a perfect mirror image, except reversed, as if Konstantin were looking at his own reflection in glass. Konstantin lowered his rifle slowly. The figure lowered its rifle shape slowly. Konstantin took a step back. The figure took a step forward. "Don't move," I said quietly. "Don't engage it." But Konstantin was young, and young men solve problems with action. He raised his rifle again and fired. The bullet passed through the figure without effect, creating a momentary disruption of frost crystals that reformed instantly. The figure tilted its head, curious almost. Then it collapsed into the snow like sugar dissolving in water, there one moment, gone the next. The temperature dropped another 2 degrees instantly. Konstantin's scream came 5 seconds later. His right hand, still gripping the rifle, had turned white. Not frostbitten white, crystalline white. I grabbed his wrist and forced open his fingers. The glove showed no damage, no tears, no breaches. But underneath, the skin was frozen solid. The tissue beneath transforming into something that looked like ice but felt like bone. We carried him back to camp at first light. I performed the amputation that morning in the medical cabin. Index and middle fingers, partial thumb. Standard procedure for severe frostbite when tissue is non-viable. But when I cut through the frozen flesh, I found something that stopped my scalpel, mid-incision. The bone inside wasn't bone anymore. It had crystallized into a structure that looked like ice, translucent, geometric, precise, but held the exact shape and density of human bone. I placed a fragment on a metal tray near the fire. It didn't melt, didn't soften, just sat there, maintaining its impossible structure, as if cold had learned to mimic life so perfectly that even heat couldn't tell the difference. Captain Orlovsky appeared in my doorway. He watched me examine the crystallized bone for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he walked forward, took the sample from my hand, and carried it directly to the camp forge. We stood together in silence and watched it burn. The crystalline bone didn't melt. It sublimated, transforming directly from solid to vapor without passing through liquid state. The vapor smelled like winter and something else, something older than winter. When the last trace had vanished, Orlovsky turned to me. "The night guard posts will now have 4 men instead of 3, he said quietly. "And you, Doctor, will be one of them." "Captain, I'm not trained for..." "Neither were the others. Neither was I. But this isn't about training anymore." He looked at me with those exhausted, pale eyes. "It's about witnessing. Someone needs to see what's happening here and survive to remember it. 3 men per post wasn't enough. Maybe 4 will be. Maybe you'll be the one who makes it back to tell someone what the cold is doing to us." He left without waiting for my response. That night, I stood at my cabin window and watched the guard detail march into the darkness. 13 men now, instead of 12. I was the 13th. The temperature had dropped to minus 52 degrees. Somewhere out there on that frozen road, something was counting, waiting, remembering. And in 48 hours, Sergeant Volkov's right hand would be completely crystallized. In 72 hours, Private Konstantin would start describing the cold as having a voice, and I would be standing beside them when it happened, watching the pattern complete itself, one frozen breath at a time. Sergeant Volkov handed me a rifle and said only one thing. "When it calls your name, Doctor, remember, your mother's voice died 20 years ago." The weight of the weapon felt foreign in my hands. I was a physician, not a soldier. My tools were scalpels and sutures, not firearms and fear. But as I stood at post 2, wooden shelter, 3 walls, open face staring into the infinite darkness of the Siberian night, I understood that medicine had no jurisdiction here. Whatever was happening on this frozen road existed beyond the reach of science, beyond the comfort of rational explanation. Volkov didn't speak as we prepared. None of them did. The 2 veterans, Grisha and Mikhail, moved with ritualistic precision, each man touching the iron chains wrapped around the guard post 3 times. Left hand, right hand, left hand again. Grisha crossed himself afterward. Mikhail spat in the snow. Volkov marked the wooden beam with chalk, 15-minute intervals, numbered 1 through 24, 6 hours, dawn at 3 in the morning, an eternity measured in frozen breath and whatever came between. "Leave your pocket watches," Volkov said quietly, the first words spoken since we'd left camp. "Time doesn't behave here. The watches make it worse. Watching the hands move wrong breaks something in your mind." I set my watch on the wooden shelf beside 3 others, 4 circles of silver and glass, already frosting over. The temperature gauge nailed to the post read minus 48 degrees Celsius. I could see my breath crystallize in the air before me, individual ice particles catching the firelight, suspended like frozen stars. My medical training catalogued the warning signs, all 3 soldiers showing elevated heart rate, shallow breathing, dilated pupils. Textbook physiological fear response, the body preparing for threats it couldn't name. The fire barrel crackled, 50 meters of road visible in each direction. Beyond that, darkness so complete it seemed to have physical weight. Then the first hour began. Sound changed first. My hearing sharpened impossibly. I could hear the individual heartbeats of the men beside me, 3 different rhythms overlapping like competing metronomes. Grisha's pulse was rapid, irregular. Mikhail's was slow but hard, pounding against his ribs like fists against a door. Volkov's was steady but wrong somehow, as if something were counting between the beats. But the camp, 2 kilometers behind us, 200 men, fires and voices and life, was completely silent. No wind, no cracking branches, no distant sounds carried on frozen air, just the breathing, the heartbeats, and the fire consuming wood that made no sound as it burned. My own breathing echoed wrong. The sound came from slightly the wrong direction, arrived a fraction of a second delayed, as if the air itself had thickened into something that resisted sound waves. The darkness had texture. I'd experienced Siberian nights before, the absolute blackness of remote wilderness, the crushing weight of winter darkness. But this was different. This darkness wasn't just absence of light, it was presence of something else. When I stared into it, I could feel it staring back, not with malice, but with attention, cold, patient, observing attention. The torchlight didn't travel the normal distance. 10 meters from the post, it simply stopped, as if hitting an invisible barrier. And the shadows didn't match the fire. They stretched in wrong directions, moved independent of the flames, created geometries that couldn't exist in three-dimensional space. I felt sweat on my forehead. Impossible. Minus 48 degrees. But my body insisted I was overheating, while my medical knowledge screamed that my core temperature was dropping toward dangerous levels. My brain was receiving contradictory signals, and I could feel my sense of time fragmenting under the cognitive load. Volkov scratched another chalk mark. 15 minutes had passed, or 2 minutes, or an hour. All three seemed equally true. Grisha's hand shot up, pointing. No words. Just the gesture, arm extended, finger rigid. Footprints were appearing in the snow, 10 meters from the post. One print materializing, then another, appearing sequentially as if an invisible figure were walking. But these weren't boot prints. These were bare feet, human feet, naked soles and toes pressed into snow at minus 48 degrees, a temperature that would cause tissue death in seconds. The prints appeared in perfect rhythm, step, 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 circling our post. I counted them, 37 prints forming a complete circle exactly 3 meters from where we stood. Then they stopped. No sound of walking, no disturbance of air, just prints appearing in sequence, then silence. Mikhail gripped his rifle so hard I could hear his knuckles cracking. Volkov made another chalk mark. The second 15-minute interval complete. Then I heard my name. Alexei. The voice was Katerina's, my wife. Dead 20 years from consumption, buried in St. Petersburg in a cemetery I visited once before, the guilt became unbearable. Her voice, exactly as I remembered, soft, with that distinctive Polish accent she'd never quite lost, the way she'd say my name with the stress on the second syllable instead of the first. Volkov's hand clamped on my shoulder, grip like iron. Don't turn. Don't answer. Alexei, why did you leave me? The voice came from the road, then from the forest, then from directly behind me. You promised you'd find a cure. You promised the medicine would work. But you lied, didn't you? You knew I was dying and you lied because you couldn't face it. Details only I would know. Private words spoken in a hospital room, witnessed by no one, carried to the grave and never repeated. Impossible for anyone else to know. Impossible for this thing, whatever it was, to know. Unless it had reached into my mind and pulled out memories, like photographs from a drawer. My medical training catalogued this as auditory hallucination, stress-induced psychosis, hypothermia, related cognitive disruption, but my medical training also said that 4 men couldn't experience simultaneous individual hallucinations with this level of specificity, because they were hearing voices too. Volkov stood rigid, staring straight ahead, lips moving in silent prayer or curse. Grisha had both hands over his ears, but I could see tears freezing on his cheeks. Mikhail was trembling, entire body vibrating like a struck bell. 4 voices, 4 different voices, all speaking simultaneously but individually, each voice audible only to its target. Katerina's voice continued, I waited for you, Alexei. In the cold ground, I waited. But you never came back. You ran. You always run. Even now you're running, hiding in Siberia with your debts and your cowardice. But I found you. I've been waiting in the cold, and the cold remembers everything. The voice wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was coming from inside my skull, vibrating through bone and brain tissue. Turn around, Alexei. Just turn around. I'll explain everything. I'll show you why the cold is better than the fire, why freezing is mercy compared to burning. Turn around and I'll make you understand. My body began turning, not by choice, not by decision. My muscles were contracting without conscious command, rotating my head and shoulders toward the darkness behind me, toward the source of the voice that promised answers and explanations and relief from 20 years of guilt. I felt Mikhail's tackle before I saw it, his full weight slamming into me, driving me down into the snow, his hand clamping over my mouth. His face was centimeters from mine, and his eyes held pure, absolute terror. "It was behind you," he whispered. "It looked exactly like you." The temperature dropped, not gradually, not the slow decline of winter night. This was instantaneous, -48 to -52 in the space between heartbeats. The air itself seemed to solidify, becoming something between gas and liquid, pressing against exposed skin with physical force. Frost formed on the road surface in patterns, the symbols, the ones from Babushka Darya's bark pieces, circles within circles, radiating lines, pictographic warnings rendered in ice and crystalline structure. They glowed faint blue, not reflected firelight, something else. Phosphorescence, bioluminescence, some property of ice that wasn't supposed to exist. 7 figures materialized in an arc facing our post. Humanoid, frost constructed, translucent bodies with geometric internal structure visible through crystalline skin. Each figure resembled someone: Volkov, Grisha, a man I didn't recognize, a woman in peasant dress, a child, an old soldier, and me. They stood motionless, but when I looked away and looked back, their positions had shifted. Closer, always closer. They had no eyes, just empty. Ooh, sockets. But they were watching. I could feel their attention like pressure against my skull. Then they spoke. All 7 voices simultaneously overlapping, creating harmonics that made my teeth ache. Russian words, but the syntax was backward, reversed, as if language itself were being processed incorrectly. Sun the remember we, cold the forgotten have you, pattern the join. Volkov translated automatically. We remember the sun, you have forgotten the cold, join the pattern. He raised his rifle and fired. The bullet passed through the nearest figure, the one that looked like him, creating a splash of frost particles that caught the firelight like diamond dust. Beautiful, terrible. The figure collapsed into scattered crystals, then reformed. 3 seconds, perfect reconstruction. The crystalline sergeant stood exactly as before, watching with empty eyes. The temperature dropped 4 degrees. Volkov fired again. Same result. Another 4-degree drop. He lowered his rifle slowly, understanding flooding his face. "They're not attacking," I said, hearing my voice from very far away. "They're converting." My right hand. I looked down and saw the skin turning translucent, not frostbitten, not damaged, transforming. I could see the outline of bones beneath, but the bones were changing. Frost crystal formations growing inside the marrow, geometric patterns spreading through the organic tissue like ice flowers blooming in time-lapse. No pain. The process felt natural, inevitable, like evolution compressed into minutes. Volkov held up his own hand. Same transformation, more advanced. The crystallization had reached past his wrist, geometric patterns visible beneath skin that looked like frosted glass. "Fire keeps them at distance," he said quietly. "Iron disrupts them temporarily, but nothing stops them." The previous guard unit, all 12 men, transformed completely, walked into the forest in formation. Captain Orlovsky ordered bayonet execution. We tracked them. 3 kilometers before. He stopped. Before we realized Orlovsky's left hand was already transforming. He's been hiding it with a glove for 2 weeks. The 7 figures advanced, 1 meter closer. I checked Volkov's chalk marks, calculated the rate of approach, 30 minutes until they reached our post. Volkov pulled a paper from his coat, sealed orders, wax stamp bearing the Imperial Eagle. He broke the seal and read aloud, "If manifestations reach guard post, retreat is authorized. Fall back to camp. Prepare for final protocol." "What's final protocol?" I asked. Volkov looked at his crystallizing hand, then at the approaching figures, then at me. His expression was absolutely calm. "It means Orlovsky burns Section 47 to the ground with everyone in it, and we have 30 minutes to convince him there's another way.